Hello everybody and welcome back to Spooky Season. Last year, for the month of October, I made videos on 4 different horror games, but this month we've upgraded to making 9 videos centred around horror games, so make sure to subscribe so you can watch them all. But today, we're taking a look at Alan Wake 2, a game that many called amazing, many have called pretentious, and ultimately, a game that thinks it's smarter than you. So let's first begin with the gameplay. At its core, Alan Wake 2 is survival horror. You've got all the staples, you've got the limited resources, the lurking enemies, and environments that demand you inch forward with caution. The flashlight mechanic does make a return, but this time it's sharper and much more deliberate. Burning away the darkness still feels great, but now it carries a bit more tension because enemies are more unpredictable than in the first game. I really enjoyed the first Alan Wake, I thought it was a great game. But at no point did I actually think the game was very scary, and I do think that Alan Wake 2 rectifies this in some pretty interesting ways. Gunplay has had a serious glow up, obviously, compared to the first game as well. Weapons hit a lot harder, the sound design makes every shot crack through the silence, and the recoil system helps keep you a bit more grounded. You're not necessarily mowing down hordes, at least not very often. You're carefully picking your targets and you're making every bullet count. Remedy has very clearly studied the genre's recent resurgence. If you think of the sort of Resident Evil 2 remake that kind of brought this third-person sort of style of survival horror back into the mainstream, and they've clearly built their systems to feel equally weighty and precise. But the real twist here is how the game refuses to let you stay in that rhythm for too long. With Saga, you've got the Mind Place, this detective board space where you pin clues, you connect threads, and effectively build the case yourself. It's not just menus and text dumps, it's an interactive way of processing the information that makes you feel like the detective rather than just reading exposition that's been dumped on you. You actually figure things out for yourself rather than just watching Saga figure things out. And then there are the set pieces as well. Remedy has this knack for throwing you into moments that blur the line between gameplay and theatre. One minute you're creeping down a hallway with a few bullets left, and the next you're swept into full-on audio-visual spectacle that feels handcrafted to be memorable. Now let's talk about the fear factor. Is Alan Wake 2 scary? That depends on what kind of horror gets under your skin. If you're after pure jump scares, it does have them. It does this really annoying jump scare thing where they just fling scary images at you without warning that feels really cheap, and I'm not a fan of. But thankfully that's not all they've got going on here. The game thrives on atmosphere. Long stretches of oppressive quiet, forests that feel like they're swallowing you whole, rooms that are just creepy. Enemies aren't constant in this game, they are sporadic, which makes you paranoid in the downtime. You start expecting something to leap out and attack you, and sometimes it just doesn't. And that kind of restraint makes the actual attacks land harder. Suspense is the greatest tool in engineering scares, and Remedy clearly understood this with Alan Wake 2. Personally, I didn't find Alan Wake 2 overly scary. I always find it a lot more difficult to be scared in a game when I have a gun and I have a decent amount of ammo for that gun, because I know I can defend myself. But I will admit the game does have a very eerie atmosphere that works well. And this is where the pretentious or brilliant debate kind of comes into play. On one hand, the investigative sequences and abstract set pieces could feel like Remedy pulling you out of the fear just to show off how cool they are and how innovative they've been with this mind palace. On the other hand, that's exactly what gives Alan Wake 2 its personality. If it were only about gunplay and scares, it would be competent, maybe even excellent. But it would feel like every other survival horror game we've got over the last 5 years. It would feel too familiar. It would be something we've seen before. Instead, Remedy injects mechanics that deliberately disrupt this formula that you're used to, making the tension feel less predictable and the experience much more memorable. If the gameplay builds the foundation of Alan Wake 2, the world is what elevates it into something stranger, in my opinion. Remedy has always been about crafting spaces that feel both grounded and uncanny at the same time, and in Alan Wake 2 I feel that they're at their peak here. Bright Falls and its surrounding areas look incredible. Dense forests, foggy lakes, run-down buildings, all built with a kind of lived-in authenticity that makes the supernatural elements hit harder when they bleed into the normal. Lighting is one of this game's biggest weapons. It's not just about what you can or can't see, it's about how the game constantly manipulates your sense of safety. A flashlight beam feels like a lifeline, but beyond its reach, the dark is overwhelming. The street lamps, the neon signs, every light source feels deliberate, like it's part of a bigger visual language that keeps reminding you how fragile illumination is in this world. Remedy doesn't just light scenes for atmosphere, they choreograph them to the most minute detail. A single shift in brightness can make a familiar space suddenly feel hostile. Sound design is also equally sharp. You'll hear branches snapping sometimes, you'll hear distorted whispers, wondering where the hell they're coming from, and you can hear enemies sometimes before they appear on the screen, so you know they're there, you know they're coming at some point, but you don't quite know when. Even the moments of silence are engineered to feel loud, with long stretches of just you. You're the only sound you can hear, and the absence of noise becomes its own kind of dread. Where is everything? Why can't I hear something? What is the game building up to? And then there's Alan's side of things in the dark place. This is where the world inside a world idea sort of takes full effect. The environments here feel like corrupted reflections of reality. City streets that loop back, theatres that melt into alleyways, offices that shift as you walk through. It's less about survival horror mechanics as you've come to know them, and more about existing in a dream logic space. These sections are pure Remedy, playful, self-aware and surreal, in a way that almost dares you to accuse the game of being pretentious. The live action sequences also deserve a special mention. Remedy has played with this before, notably in Quantum Break, a game that is very underrated actually. If possible, you should play Quantum Break. But here it feels fully integrated. At first it's quite jarring, it can break the immersion because all of a sudden you're looking at real people in your video game, but over time I actually feel like it becomes a big part of the immersion and definitely a big part of the story. Because the entire narrative is about layers of fiction and realities bleeding together. The game is essentially telling you, yes, this is artificial, but that artificiality is the point. This is exactly where the pretentious versus brilliant question comes back into play again. I can see how some could find the live action indulgent, like Remedy is just trying too hard to be artsy, like look at me, we've got live action sections in this game, but to me I actually felt that it really fit the game because it leans into the idea that the story isn't bound by a single medium, which is kind of the whole point of the story and kind of the point of Alan Wake in the first place. The world isn't a stage you play on, it is a collage. It's stitched together from everything Remedy can throw at it, with the digital environments, the film performances, the soundscapes, the lighting tricks. So is the world of Alan Wake 2 pretentious? In places, absolutely. It loves to remind you that you're inside someone else's vision, but that same boldness is what makes it unforgettable. Few horror games go this far in blending atmosphere, visuals and metafiction into one cohesive identity. Before we move on to the story though, if you are enjoying the video, then please consider subscribing, as we are trying to reach 2,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and we are definitely cutting it a bit close, so any help would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much, but now to the story. On the surface, Alan Wake 2 has one of the most ambitious stories that Remedy has ever attempted. Instead of following a single protagonist like the first game, this time we're being split into two: Saga Anderson, an FBI agent investigating murders in Bright Falls, and Alan Wake, the writer still trapped in the dark place after the events of the original. The dual structure is more than a gimmick, it is the backbone of how this narrative unfolds. Saga's sections give you a detective story, something grounded, methodical, and emotionally relatable. You're solving puzzles, you're interrogating suspects, and piecing together a mystery that feels like it could belong in a prestige TV drama. Meanwhile, Alan's journey is far more abstract. He's navigating a world that bends around him, where storytelling itself is the weapon and the prison. His arc is surreal, disjointed, and deliberately harder to pin down. You will have to swap words around in different areas to change your environments. It's really weird. It's a lot more puzzle-based, I felt, than Saga's sections, and while I don't think they were as strong as Saga's sections, I really appreciate what they went for with the gameplay of Alan's sections of the game. The beauty and sometimes the frustration of this sort of dual setup is how the two threads constantly reframe each other. Just as Saga's investigation feels like it's getting solid answers, Alan's perspective undermines your sense of reality. Just as Alan feels adrift, Saga pulls things back into something you can hold on to. It's a constant push and pull between the clarity and the chaos. And this is where the pretentious or brilliant debate again comes roaring back. The duality could feel like Remedy are flexing their writing muscles a little bit too hard. Like, look at what we can do, layering the symbolism and the metaphors, when a simpler narrative could potentially have been more direct. But I would argue it's exactly what makes the game stand out in the first place. It refuses to flatten its story into a single comfortable lane. It asks you to juggle two conflicting perspectives, and in doing so, makes you feel the instability that its characters are living through. Alan's story in particular leans hard into the metafiction. The Dark Place is less a location itself and more a sort of physical narrative device. A place where words reshape environments, where scenes are rewritten before your eyes, and where you're never sure if you're watching a character act or a writer draft. Saga, on the other hand, grounds the supernatural in a very human lens. Her backstory, her motivations, her emotional reactions, they're all incredibly human, and they keep the game tethered when it risks floating into pure abstraction. This duality could absolutely be read as self-indulgent. Remedy is always unapologetically interested in narrative experiments that might alienate anyone who just wants a straightforward horror story. But for those who buy into it, the weaving of Saga and Alan's perspectives creates a narrative that feels alive, messy, layered, and constantly evolving. What stands out is how the two protagonists aren't necessarily just parallels, they're deeply interconnected, to the point that one can't really exist without the other. Saga's investigation isn't simply about Bright Falls, it's about understanding Alan's plight and its ripples into the real world. Alan's struggle in the Dark Place isn't just about his survival, it's about how his words shape Saga's reality, often without him even realising it. The big narrative trick here is that you experience that interconnection firsthand. You are not just told that their stories overlap, you play the overlap. You switch the perspectives in ways that reveal new truths about events you've already seen. Sometimes it's thrilling, sometimes it's disorienting, and sometimes it feels like the game is showing off how clever it can be. But the end result is that the story becomes a loop, a reflection of itself, and you're caught in that cycle just as much as the characters are. Is that pretentious? Definitely. It's the kind of literary, layered storytelling that games rarely attempt, and Remedy knows exactly how unconventional and how smart it's being. But it's also brilliant because it uses the medium of games, player perspective, choice of protagonist, repetition with variation, to make the narrative structure itself part of the experience. So where does that leave Alan Wake 2? On one level, it is a polished survival horror game, with tighter combat, smarter design, and a fear factor that comes not just from the jump scares, but from the atmosphere and the restraint. On another level, it's Remedy taking big creative swings, set pieces that feel more like theatre, detective boards that slow you down in deliberate ways, and a world stitched together from light, sound, and even live action fragments. Then there's the story, a dual narrative that's equal parts grounded and surreal, inviting you to question not just what's happening, but how it's being told. This could absolutely add up to something overly self-indulgent. A game that's constantly nudging you to admire its cleverness, look how cool we are, can sometimes cost the momentum as well. But this is exactly why it's special. It dares to be ambitious in a genre that could easily get away with more formulaic design. If Remedy decided not to include any of the pretentious stuff and just create a survival horror game with the gameplay and the mechanics and the world that the game has already, the game would still have been well received. It would still have been a good survival horror game. But it wouldn't have been special. Alan Wake 2 thinks it's smarter than you. Sometimes that comes across as smug. Sometimes it lands with real power. But whether you call it pretentious or brilliant, the fact is this: very few games would risk being either. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. I hope that you did enjoy it. If you did, then please consider leaving a like, because that really does help me out. And please make sure to subscribe so that you can see it all. I'm putting a lot of effort into this. It is not easy to make 9 videos in a month for me, so I really hope that you guys appreciate the effort, and you can show that by subscribing. But for now, that is all. Have a nice day, and goodbye.